All right. Well, yes, I can. I can hear you, Kelsey and Victoria. Yes. Okay. Good. All right. Well, I don't need to hear you. All I just need is some direction. So, um, if you have some questions, that would be great. And I know you can't see anything except the clutter in my office at this point, but what you will be able to see. Um, What you will be able to see is my screen and the chat session. So I suppose you're looking at the chat session at the moment and um, this mess of an office. So go ahead and send me some questions if you'd like. I know we haven't had lectures in here, and I should probably explain why. For the most part, I've done online lectures and recorded lectures, and my experience is that's not really what online students necessarily want. Now, if you've logged into this, you might be one who actually would like to have recorded lectures. And I can do that. It's more of it takes a lot of time on my end, but my experience is that a lot of students don't even listen to the lectures when I record them. So I've tried to put together material that is more textual, that is more accessible in terms of what they call asynchronous courses. So my study guides and uh, the quizzes tend to help walk you through the material. And I know I have a lot of reading too. So if if you have questions specifically about anything in the format, let's talk about that. You've At this point, you've done your preliminary draft, and I've gotten you a little bit of feedback on the preliminary draft, and you should have submitted the final draft of the first very small essay. And I will have another assignment for you coming up soon. So, but I'd like for you to make sure you get through the reading this week, and we've got an exam next Friday, so we've got a lot of work to do. Um, anyway, here's a question. All right, Tori, can I call you Tori? My first question is, how can fresh college graduates with an architecture degree promote conservation through their work? Wow. Well, number one, let's figure out what we mean by conservation. Are you a fresh college graduate? You have an architecture degree? I mean, perhaps I guess you're getting ready to, but architecture is certainly, uh, relevant to conservation. There's a lot I've been reading a lot about um, sort of aesthetics and architecture lately, interestingly, and one critic in particular I've been reading a lot is one who is very, very critical of very modern architect design public buildings, and it's kind of funny, but yeah, in terms of conservation, certainly, we can. There are all sorts of trends going on. I visited New Orleans recently, and visited one of these so-called green design uh, uh, communities where people who had been displaced by Katrina, uh, 15 years ago now, um, are settling in this part of the lower Ninth Ward, and the houses they're constructing in this area are supposedly energy efficient and so forth. So, there are all sorts of things out there that are conservation oriented. Um, I was hoping perhaps that's a nice question, maybe something you could do a paper on or something. I'm not really prepared to address your question like that, but in terms of the format of the course, do you have something something that I could maybe help you in terms of your studying. I don't know how the course is going for you on your end. That's one reason I'd like to have this session. Kelsey says, I like that the reading material is available to us, but I get so bored of learning about history that I would personally benefit from video lectures. Okay. Well, let's see here. By the way, just to let you know, I was expecting all of you. And, all right, well, video lectures. I could do something like this to talk about individual folks. And remember, you're going to have a lot of, I'm going to talk more about these individuals, these people. So that's why I've posted, I don't know, I've tried not to post too many videos. And these videos are done, well, let me scroll through here. If we look at the study guide, I have a number of sort of short 10-minute, 15-minute at the most videos on some of these individuals. So initially, this first exam is going to cover what I call this history and philosophy thing. We're not going to talk much about any one individual, but we will once we get into the different themes. So, for example, when we're talking about soil conservation, we'll discuss more about the evolution of Soil Conservation Service and talk about the Dust Bowl and that sort of thing. But here you're getting more. What I want to do is just to try to give you an idea of the evolution of conservation in the United States as what I call an ethic, sort of a mindset. And that, if you haven't noticed, goes way back. I mean, we talk a lot about the 19th century, and that's when things are really developing. And so I want you to know, we can't really talk so much about Thoreau because Thoreau really wasn't a conservationist. He was just a thinker. Emerson wasn't a conservationist, but he was a writer, and so American literature had an important impact on conservation thought among American intellectuals and, to a degree, the American public. Emerson and Thoreau, contemporaries, friends, living in the same town, Concord, Massachusetts, and Emerson was a kind of a rock star at the time. Thoreau was a nobody, and it was unknown essentially until after he died, and he was really popularized in the 60s. So they're very different sort of, they're both transcendentalists, but they had very different impacts. And, I guess what I want you to do is I want you to be thinking about these main figures in conservation history for this first exam, and then you'll learn a little bit more. I want you to know, for example, who Carl Schurz was. Who was that guy? He was a Secretary of the Interior, and what's significant about him is that he was sort of a German import. And because he had experience with forestry in Central Europe, Germany, he brought this theme, or he brought this management, sort of scientific management attitude to the Department of the Interior at a time when the United States was experiencing rapid deforestation, primarily because of the industrial demand for timber and for lumber. And this, Secretary of the Interior was someone who began this attitude that, hey, maybe we better manage our forests rather than just opening them up to exploitation. And even though Schertz was not successful in, he wasn't politically successful in getting this conservation and forest conservation movement going, he was an early player and had a little bit of an impact that sort of paved the way for the more significant fellow, who maybe one of you can guess. Okay, so I'm starting to lecture, and with me in a room by myself talking about trees and forest conservation is kind of scary. But the person I'm wanting you to think about is Gifford Pinchot. Gifford Pinchot would be the real reformer when it came to forest conservation. And then, so this is where kind of the conservation dichotomy opens up in the latter part of the 1800s. And Gifford Pinchot is what we call a utilitarian. And then we have, and his idea is, well, we can have the forests and we can cut lumber because they're renewable resources. But then we have the redwoods or the sequoias in California. And you can't have a tree farm made of sequoias because they're hundreds of years old, and we're not going to return giant sequoias back very quickly. So John Muir comes into the picture, and John Muir is very different in terms of his attitude. Pinchot is the utilitarian. Let's cut the forest and enjoy them too, and manage them so that we have them forever. Muir is a preservationist, and he says absolutely not. We can't afford to use this resource. And so this renewable resource of giant redwoods in California becomes one of those resources that is a national treasure. Okay, so we have natural resources, and then we have national treasures, and this is where this division takes off. And I hope you've seen that in the readings and maybe in the videos. And who is the real action figure of conservation in the early part of the 20th century? It's in late 19th century. It's Teddy Roosevelt. So Roosevelt is this president who's the first real environmental or conservation president, and he works with both Muir and Gifford Pinchot and tries to work this out. And so he is very much a leader in terms of trying to do the best, trying to make the best decisions for the people who want to preserve forests forever and the national treasures of the giant redwoods, and also be realistic and economically realistic in that resources need to be utilized. Some resources need to be utilized just to the maximum benefit of as many people as possible, and in a frugal way as possible. So these are very different ideas, very different philosophies, if you will, of conservation. And that's what I'm wanting you to get a little bit here, okay? So Kelsey has another question then. Are we getting a final exam study guide, or is it based off of the weekly study guides? Well, I think what I can tell you there is that the final exam is, as you know, part comprehensive. What I'm going to do here is basically, I'm not going to throw curveballs at you, but the final exam in many ways is going to be very repetitive, okay? So it could very well be that the final exam includes some of the same questions that you would receive in the first exam and the second exam. So we've got another question. Tori asks, why, and so in terms of a study guide, let me think about that, okay? Maybe we can do one of these as a study guide, maybe as a review, something like that. While reading the course material, I learned that environmentalism grew from the conservation movement. I am just wondering, what are the differences that separate these? Fantastic question. All right, this is one of those things I was hoping you would see. And if you read Gary Klee's article, or Gary Klee's chapter, the really long chapter with lots and lots of names and that sort of thing, he touches on that. So exactly, the environmental movement. If I were to pin it down, I would say that well, some people go all the way back to Earth Day, the very first Earth Day, which was 1970. And it's always like on the, April 22nd, something like that, which also is Land Run Day in Oklahoma. But April 22nd, about 1970. And Earth Day was kind of the thing that a lot of historians will point to as sort of the emergence of a real environmental movement. You could even go back a little bit farther than that to 1962. Does anybody know the significance of 1962? What would you say in the chat? I'm looking over here to my right because that's where my other computer is, where you're chatting. So I can see that. You'll be able to see it a little bit. I don't know how this is going to work, but we're going to see if this works a little bit better. Okay. Not sure about 1962. All right, well, that was the year that this book was published. Very famous book, Silent Spring, all right, by Rachel Carson. And this is the one, and this is an introduction by Vice President Al Gore. Okay, so this is not the original one. But Silent Spring was is often referred to as the book that really kind of started the environmental movement. So if you recall, if you've looked at Rachel Carson's stuff, Rachel Carson was a very interesting woman. There's a really good Netflix, a really good documentary on her life in Netflix at the moment. At least it was there a year ago or so. And she was an ocean or a marine biologist, basically. And she wrote a few other interesting books. One is called The Sea Around Us, and another one is called The Edge of the Sea. Okay, it doesn't really, anyway, The Edge of the Sea. You can see that. And Carson was a very intelligent scientist, and she worked for the federal government. And anyway, she wound up being a kind of a whistleblower type with Silent Spring, which was not her first book. Silent Spring was an expose basically identifying DDT as producing all sorts of environmental problems, and for the most part, the idea of silent spring refers to not any birds chirping in the spring, because those birds had not hatched from their eggs, because the eggs were soft and they cracked in the nest. And this is something that has been linked to the disappearance of especially birds of prey that feed on fish, because they get the concentration of the DDT in their systems. Anyway, so Carson, 1962, environmental movement. The reaction of the public to this book, this is a best-selling book, the reactions of the public, really kind of launched an approach to the environment that, wait a minute, we've got to do something about what's going on in the world. And in the 1960s, the villain was largely you know, um, pointed to as corporate America, right? So that's sort of the beginning of the environmental movement. Now that came out of conservation. I'm trying to answer your question here, Tori. The conservation movement is something much older, and it has really not so much to do with environmental poisoning of pesticides, but it does come out of the same concern for the environment, but really with a kind of a different attitude. So, and the thing that I wanted you to see is that emergence of a very, a more extreme, I guess, approach to dealing with problems, and sort of a professionalization of environmentalism to this day. There are conservation organizations that got started in the 1800s, and you could probably call the Sierra Club originally a conservation organization, although it was John Muir, and they were more preservation oriented. But the Sierra Club today continues to be a very strong environmentalist organization. Take, for example, the contrast between the Sierra Club and the Boone and Crockett Club, started by Teddy Roosevelt and George Bird Grinnell, for example. And this was an organization begun by hunters, and the idea was that they would promote sportsmanship or sportsmanlike behavior in the field by hunters. So they were the ones who were responsible for getting what they called market hunting made illegal. Now, they were not anti-hunter, okay, but so many environmental organizations today are. So you can see a big divergence there between conservation, that is, those who are interested in utilizing resources like wildlife resources or fisheries for sports. They were very important in developing protections that brought all sorts of game animals back to stable populations from being overhunted. George Bird Grinnell, for example, was had a part in the recovery of the American bison, and we could go on and on there. So I hope I answered that question. So environmentalism, yeah, conservation is earlier, environmentalism grows out of that. But you kind of see John Muir back in the 1800s as sort of starting that environmentalist approach. And even today, a lot of environmentalists still can, they still have a strong affinity for John Muir. They have a strong affinity for people like Henry David Thoreau, more spiritual, okay, perhaps than the hunters and the fisher people who started the Isaac Walton League, groups like that. Okay, next question. You all are so much nicer than all of those streamers on Twitch, okay, which is kind of interesting to watch, but we're not talking about video games here. So, well, anyway, I don't have lectures so much, but I do have some videos, and if I post videos, then you can probably bet that I think those are probably fairly important. The tougher videos are probably the ones toward the bottom of that page, and I want to give you sort of a range of ideas here: conservation, environmentalism or preservation, and then we have a very different approach, a more of an economic approach, in which you have Milton Friedman, Nobel laureate in economics, the one man who is largely associated with a term within economics referred to as monetarism, who is giving a lecture back in the 70s, and in this lecture, he brings up some really interesting points. For example, he makes a point that, it may be that resource conservation tends to inhibit innovation. And that's a scary thought, because if we're successfully slowing down a particular type of energy technology, for example, if we're able to slow down the consumption of a particular type of energy like coal, then according to economic theory, at least as Milton Friedman is indicating it, this tends to slow down innovations that could replace those dirty energies. So anyway, you can listen to that and think about it, because the point here is that I don't have all the answers, and I don't think anyone does. And if they do say they have all the answers, never trust anybody who says they have all the answers. Okay, it's a confusing, varied subject, conservation. All right, I don't want to waste your time, so any other questions? There are a lot of points in here, like unintended consequences and planning and these sorts of things. Believe it or not, the people like Carl Schurz, who I mentioned, they were coming out of Europe at a time when science was on the rise. The Enlightenment had really pushed science into in the public eye as something that was revolutionary and something that was replacing other things, like replacing politics as usual, replacing religion as usual. And out of Central Europe, in particular Germany, in the 1860s, 1870s, we begin to see more of a scientific approach to things like society. And this is where the planning facet of conservation arrives into the United States. And even Gifford Pinchot, who is a conservationist, is affected by French and German ideas about the need for planning. And by that I mean societal planning and planning the use of natural resources, as opposed to the traditional American economic approach, which is laissez-faire of the 19th century. That is, private property rights, small government, and a lack of central decision making. And so in the 1870s, 1880s, we begin to see an infusion of European centralization ideas, and that hasn't gone away. So America before the 1870s was a very, very different America. Okay, I have a question. Kelsey says, is it possible to get the next essay prompt when the previous essay final is due for those of us who work ahead? I intend to get that to you very, very quickly. You can go ahead and get started with it if you have an idea of the particular invasive species that you'd like to write about. So you can go ahead and start searching if you want to. It doesn't really matter to me. I'm going to give you some ideas. I have a list of some invasive species, particularly in Oklahoma, that you might look at. But you pick an invasive species and write about it. And it doesn't even have to be in the United States. I don't. We have one student, Stephen, from Australia, and he probably has plenty of great examples from his own country of feral cats and rabbits and goats and everything else. The United States has plenty of invasives as well. In Oklahoma, we have some really serious problems with things that you probably wouldn't think too much about, like zebra mussels and so forth. So invasive species don't have to be animals either. They can definitely be plants. We got a lot of invasive plants. Invasive plants are actually probably easier to study because there's, anyway, I'll get that to you as soon as I can. Okay. Well, we got three. Let's see, three of us are here now. We have three people online. I guess we just have two of you now. Kelsey, Tori, and I guess, I don't know, Haley ever show up? Just the two of you, huh? Well, let's do this. Since only two of you out of the 18 or 16 or how many we got in here showed up, why don't you help me identify some of the exam questions for the first exam? How about that? Who are these? I've got this list of people. I don't know if you saw the timeline yet. I've got a timeline here of conservation, environmentalist sorts of things. And this was by no means comprehensive, and not even comprehensive for the class, but I'm still adding to it. So you might have a look at that. You might have a look at some of the personalities, Frank Chapman, probably not going to ask you about him. Aldo Leopold, I've got a video there. That probably means I'm going to ask you about Aldo Leopold. I mean, I just like his name, Aldo. Now, he was a really, really interesting fellow. Had interest in soils, vegetation, wildlife. Excuse me. So tell me some of out of these folks, who are some that you find more interesting than others? Or perhaps there are some who you were surprised about. Maybe you would give me some hints as to the ones that I should maybe ask you questions on the exam about. So I'll wait for you to chat and let me know. Well, I've already mentioned Roosevelt, as in Theodore Roosevelt. His later Roosevelt, Franklin D. Roosevelt, was also considered a very important conservation president. But okay, so can you repeat the question? Yeah, sure. My question is, out of these personalities and maybe organizations that I've listed on the study guide number 2, which is, I'm referring to sort of the history and philosophy of conservation in general. Who among these folks do you find just really interesting for some reason? Did you get that? Okay, Kelsey's going to give me somebody here. I've talked about Carl Schurz. Ferdinand Hayden, was a photographer. So he was in on the Yellowstone expedition. He was a geographer too. Thomas Moran, painter. Frederick Law Olmsted, designer of Central Park. I've got, if you're in architecture and landscape architecture, and I have a few of you, I'm sure you're probably interested in people like Olmsted. Hornaday. Hornaday was a kind of a controversial guy. If you're in zoology, you should probably know who William T. Hornaday was. Okay, Kelsey's still typing. So what I'm hoping is, the exam. Exam's not a very long exam. Only 40 questions. It won't take you very long at all. So um, and hopefully by the time that you finish the third quiz, you will have a pretty good idea of what to expect. Um, so Kelsey's still typing a really long question for me. I guess I could look at the first study guide. I didn't put a lot of videos in there, but you do have quite a few questions here. So, a lot about Roosevelt and things we've already talked about. Okay. I really haven't gotten to most of the people. Some days where my heart's saying, okay. All right. No problem. How about Tori? Tori, or do you have anybody in particular you're thinking of? Anybody you'd like for me to discuss a little bit more? We're going on 40 minutes. I'm impressed. 2 people, 40 minutes. How about the readings? Which of the readings would you prefer exam questions to be pulled from? Oh, okay. Olmsted, of course, because you're like in architecture, right? Um, yeah, Frederick Law Olmsted. Well, his particularly significant in terms of his his ideas about urban life. So in New York City, you've got this gargantuan in right in the middle of Manhattan, this fantastic planned landscape that is recreational. It's a way for people to escape that urban jungle and see nature. So that's one reason he's in there. The chapter by Gary Klee discusses him a little bit more, and so anyway, you can see what Klee has to say about him. I don't know if you read that long, boring email that I sent the other day about yard work, but that's kind of what I'm thinking about here. My own interests are in terms of geography. They're always changing a little bit, but one of my own current interests is sort of the significance of just what we might just call home. And one facet of American life is that that need for the home, and that and I'm not referring to a suburban single family residence necessarily. I'm talking about a place that you call home. And so that's I'm not really sure where I'm going with that, but that's one thing that's been on my mind a lot. So I guess I was in the email, I was telling you a little bit about things like the economic idea of or the sort of the Marxist approach to what we do in our home to make it a nice place. And that's really what conservation's all about. We want to keep our and as a society, we want to keep our country and our environment nice. So we want to keep it healthy. We want it to be there for our future generations. And in a lot of ways, that's, to me, it's a lot like the same thing that we do at the family level. We have a home, and we want to raise our family and protect our family within that home environment. We want to have a place for our children and our relatives to come back to. And in a sense, the home, whether it's your home or whether you're talking about the natural environment, is is something that we have a responsibility to look after. And one way of looking at this is one particular philosopher that I've been reading a lot of work from views, your home or your environment, your natural resources, your country, views that as an inheritance from the past. And this inheritance is passed down from people long dead. And so there's a contract, in a sense, or even a covenant, if you will, between the people in the past who have allowed this to be here and to exist, and you in the present, the alive in the present. And then another part of that covenant is connected to the yet unborn, the people in the future, the people who will be your grandchildren. And so there's this covenant between the dead, the living, and the unborn. And that's something that's really kind of fascinated me about, whether you're talking about your own home and family or you're talking about the entire country and the future. That it's very much related to conservation and preservation. So anyway, I'm also wondering if there are other resources we can use besides Wikipedia pages, or do you believe we just need to know more general information about these people? I like Wikipedia. I don't intend for you to use Wikipedia as the primary source. I only put that there just to kind of make it easy for you to maybe see another source. But of course, Wikipedia has other sources too, So the nice thing I like about Wikipedia is you can see a picture. If you're wondering about, well, who's this Hugh Hammond Bennett guy? Well, okay, we can open a link and check him out. Okay, and there he is. There's Hugh Bennett. He is he was kind of the father of the Soil Conservation Service, and I've got a little video on him too. So you'll see more of him later when we talk about soil. But interesting, Southern gentleman. You can read more about it. I don't expect you to know everything on Wikipedia about him at all. That's not my point, okay? So I hope that is clear. That's simply for your reference. I'm also wondering if okay, so does that answer your question? All right. Now, the thing is, if I put a video up, I'll probably ask you questions about specific stuff in the video, particularly if I put questions below that video, okay? But if you see Wikipedia links, don't think you have to read Wikipedia necessarily, okay? I kind of like for you to know where they are sort of in history. You don't have to know that. I put the dates of their birth and death just to kind of give you a reference as to when they were around. But you don't need to know their birth and death and all that. Okay? For example, Teddy Roosevelt, I'd like for you to know differences between Teddy Roosevelt, who was a Republican, yet what they referred to as a progressive. So he was closer, more aligned with what a moderate, a moderate would be today. Even though he was a Republican and then later a Bull Moose, but even though he was a Republican, he was different. And if you look back and consider what he did, placing millions of acres into national monuments and national forests, Roosevelt was not like most Republicans before him, and not like too many after. Although Richard Nixon was actually kind of similar to Teddy Roosevelt in his environmental views and his views of Native American people and that sort of thing. Franklin Roosevelt, on the other hand, was a Democrat and a completely different political mindset. Roosevelt was a a new Democrat, a new type of Democrat, and he was one who brought into his cabinet a lot of people who we would correctly refer to as radicals. They were completely different politically than any group of Democrats who had been in power to that time. There were certainly socialists and communists, but they were marginalized. And there were a lot of socialists within the Franklin Delano Roosevelt cabinet who believed, like most Central Europeans at the time, that planning was the way of the future. So planning from the top down is something that Roosevelt really started in the United States. All right. I hope that helps. Tori has one more question, and would we cover more current conservation efforts used in America or somewhere else in the world? Although I enjoy history and understand the importance of learning from it, I'm curious about learning how we are planning for the future now. Yeah, well, this first exam is largely a non-themed part of the course, and the material that comes after the first exam will systematically look at each of these. Well, it's 8 weeks, and we won't cover as much as I usually do in the 16-week course, but we will look at thematic stuff, and what I mean by that are soil, water resources, freshwater resources, wildlife, fisheries, forests, rangeland. These are the themes that we'll talk about, and we'll look at the specific conservation methods and techniques that have been used in conservation in those examples. And yes, now Tori, we'll actually be talking in terms of, you'll know this, or you'll perhaps appreciate this. You'll learn a lot about the Aral Sea. That's one thing that I cover. The former Aral Sea and the reviving Aral Sea. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about that, and we'll talk a little bit about planning there too. So that's an example that you, Tori, might be particularly interested in, I hope. Okay. All right. Well, it's probably about time for you all to take a break, and my voice will probably go out here in a little bit. And besides, it's almost 9 o'clock. It's nearly my bedtime. So I'm going to sign off. Unless you have any more questions, I'll give you one more chance. This has been kind of fun and interesting, and we'll see how this works out. I'll need to clean my office next time I try it. Okay. Kelsey, we'll see you, and thank you all both for participating, and I'll get your 10 points recorded ASAP. Have a nice rest of the weekend, and over and out.